Hello out there, all my 5,200 bookish friends, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics, where we romp arm in arm through the fields of classic literature from the ancient to the present. In this episode, we are going to take a look how you can put yourself through your own course on understanding the development of Gothic literature. And I know that this is something a lot of you are interested in because I've got so many requests regarding it. So, without further ado, let's get stuck in, shall we? So, I know that a lot of you out there are really interested in the Gothic genre. You enjoy reading it. It's exciting to go through. It's one of the greatest genres if you're just sitting down to have a good read. But if you're part of this channel, then you want to go further into classic literature and really begin to extract the juice out of it, to really appreciate how literature works. And so a lot of you have commented to me or sent me messages via email asking for more information on how to appreciate the Gothic genre. And to me, probably one of the best ways to understand how the Gothic works and to watch its tentacles start reaching from the past into the present, affecting books we read today, I think one of the best ways is to just take a sequence of books which you can read in your own time with a view to seeing how the genre develops. And you'll notice the tropes that stay in place, but how they are then squeezed down different side alleyways to explore society whilst maintaining that primitive sense of the sublime, of the overawing architecture of the world around us and our little place within it. So we're going to take a look at 7 books, and starting from the earliest, working up into the 20th century. And I hope you've got your pens and paper ready because you might want to jot these down as we go. So for our first Gothic novel, we want to go right back to sort of the beginning of the Gothic genre. Now there's a few people who started it off, but probably, in my opinion, the most prominent was Anne Radcliffe. And her greatest work is probably The Italian, written in 1796, I think it was. The Italian was Radcliffe at her peak. This is why it's such a good book to start with. Now, basically, the way the story goes, it's very Gothic from the off because it starts in a church. I think it's Santa Maria del Piantro, I think it is. Anyway, this Englishman is in the church and he starts talking to a friar, and he's noticed that there's this fellow in the shadows. Typical Gothic, we've got a church and we've got shadows, and it turns out that this shadowy figure is also an assassin who's sort of gaining some kind of sanctuary in the church, and the Englishman wants to know just why the church allows him to stay there. And so the friar basically says, do you see that booth over there, that confession booth? It all goes back a long time ago to when there was a particular confession. And it all started then. So can you see we've already got this very classic trope of a mysterious piece of the past. By the way, I must say this, if you want to look at another video which explains 8 aspects of what makes Gothic literature, check my other video out, which I'll put a link to down below, because it's probably the most popular video I've ever made. And yeah, anyway. The story then gets going, and what you've got is you go back to a church in a place called San Lorenzo, and you have this fellow called Vincentio di Vivaldi. I think that's right. Yeah, because it struck me, Vivaldi, like the musician. Now, he is the son of this Marchesa. You know, this Marchesa is very proud and haughty. But he sees this girl, Elena, who's very pretty, and he thinks, oh, I would like to court her. And so he sets about trying to court her and get her attentions. But his mother, the Marchesa, she doesn't want any of it. And so, because she can't stop her son, she goes to her confessor, who is Father Scadoni, a great antagonist in a Gothic book, and she asks him if you can split these two up, I will make sure that you progress in your holy orders. And so he sets about it. And Vincentio, he starts going to the villa where Elena is, when suddenly he's met by this monk, you know, with the hooded cowl and everything. This traditional image we often get, even in movies today, of someone coming through with their face hidden. And this monk looks like an apparition. So here we've got the supernatural sweeping into the story very early on. And he sort of gives the message, keep away from this estate, from this mansion, this villa. But of course, Vincentio, he wants to be with Elena, and so they start devising a way how they could get married. However, this is set in the time of the Great Inquisition. And I don't want to give anything away, so all I'll say is, things don't go according to the plan, and Father Cascadoni and the Inquisition sort of get involved, and before long you've got, you know, a typical isolated house, the classic Gothic backdrop, a great house in a sprawling wilderness, by the sea, windswept, secret passages, things that go bump in the night, lightning strikes, the whole works of the Gothic genre. So, if you want to start getting to grips with Gothic novels and how they develop, and actually this will teach you how to write Gothic novels, start with that one. If you've got to start with any, start with The Italian by Anne Radcliffe. Our second book is The Great Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. She wrote this when she was 18 or 19 years old, can you believe? And she wrote it in the year 1818, I think it was published. Now, why Frankenstein is such a great Gothic novel to read? It's short, but it's almost Gothic by numbers. What Mary Shelley manages to do, because she wrote this in quick time as part of just a messing about with her husband, Percy Shelley, and I think Byron was with them in Italy, and they said, let's write a scary story. And she wrote Frankenstein. And she follows all the classical tropes, but does it so well that she can quickly build a story, but she hides sort of the mechanics of the story, and that's why it comes across so well. So in the story, you start off, again, not in the main story, just like The Italian. You start off with a chap who's aboard a boat, heading, I think he's in the Arctic, and he's writing back to his sister, and he talks about a man they came across in the Arctic, you know, running across the snowy, packed ice. And he's taken on board and he's talking to him, and this man's haggard, worn out, crazed about pursuing some kind of monster, fiend. And he is Dr. Frankenstein, not the monster, the man. And then we go back to the story. There seems to be a common sort of idea with the early Gothic literature that you start it in the present with someone telling a story about the past. It gives that mystery to everything. Now, with Dr. Frankenstein, you see him in a lovely household, a very loving family, very close-knit with his parents. But the idea of science is brought in. So instead of sort of superstition and the supernatural, science allows Shelley to create a monster without the occult, by making it purely rational, as it were. And Dr. Frankenstein makes out of dead body parts, this creature, and he finds out the secret of bringing it to life. But then, as you probably know, things don't go according to plan. He's so appalled by what he's made that no sooner has this thing woken up, he runs out of the door and leaves it. And of course, it decides to go into society on its own and try to make its way. And it's denied love and affection, it's scorned wherever it goes, and then it becomes vengeful. Now, I won't say any more about the story, except that nature features heavily in it. You know, the mountains of Switzerland, the glaciers, there's remote islands, windswept and tossed, and lightning storms and faces at the window. There's the ominous threat of murder and attack. There's strange goings on, and the sense of tension building around the main character, and fear. Everything about this book screams Gothic, and it's a great book to learn the methodology of Gothic literature. I think it's because Shelley knew it so well just the basic structure that she could instantly write a book so good, so fast. Now, there are plenty of books, if you go to the early 19th century, which are pure Gothic sensational. But now we're coming to how Gothic is used and manoeuvred into social observation, sort of social critique. And that is the 1846 book, Jane Eyre, by Charlotte Bronte, or as she actually wrote it, under Cura Bell. She put it under a male name because it was easier to get published. Now, again, there's quite a lot about the Gothic in Jane Eyre, but you don't necessarily notice it right off the bat. You have Jane Eyre, she grows up with a stepmother and her cousins. Her father's died, so we've got a bit of a Cinderella kind of start to the book. And she's in this great house where she's treated as a naughty child and she's often locked up in a room, this idea of isolation, which is part of Gothic. Then she moves to a boarding house where she's not treated well, it's cold, the food is no good, and she keeps looking out to the horizon. So nature's there, but nature's played differently. It's not dumbed down, but it's muted. And what we get in Jane Eyre, which is different to earlier works of Gothic literature, is the inner workings of the protagonist. Jane Eyre is making social observations, very much like Dickens did. Charlotte Bronte is taking a form of literature which moves us, which grips us deeply, is why the Gothic is so enduring, but she helps us to start seeing the truth of terror, being subjected and oppressed, from the eyes of a woman in the 19th century. And then, of course, she goes to the great house, which is it Thornfield, where Mr. Rochester is. And again, you've got, it's an old sort of Elizabethan house, so it's dark, heavy wood, it's not well lit. And then you've got things that go bump in the night and, you know, all these different doors. And again, you have certain, not supernatural, but mysterious coincidences. The weather, lightning, plays a role. And again, nature does play a role in matching her psychological connection to what she's going through. She goes through a various number of different trials. You sense her fear at times, but it's not the purest Gothic. It's not just a novel that's sensational, that makes us go, whoa, what a cracking read. We get to see the feelings, the depth of emotion, the stifling of the personality of Jane Eyre by means of this Gothic atmosphere. So it's engaging, but it would resonate with so many women and by also men who love their wives and daughters, who could see the unfairness of society. And it was actually a great feminist work, proto-feminist you could call it, and actually unlocked the box for loads of feminist literature to come. So there is the next book I would suggest you read on your self-journey, self-education of Gothic literature, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. The next book we want to come to is actually a novella. We're going to look at two short kind of stories when it comes to the Gothic genre and learning how it developed. And this one is the 1886 novella Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, written by Robert Louis Stevenson. Jekyll and Hyde is, again, it's a great demonstration of how Gothic began to leak into other forms of writing. There's a certain modernity, a growing towards the modern style of writing in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But what grips us, what enthralls us, is the Gothic environment. And we see again various amounts of the Gothic tropes. Specifically in this one, building on the idea of science and on psychology, what you've got in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is that split personality. Dr. Jekyll is good and an upright citizen and looked upon with high regard. He's an upstanding man, your typical gentleman. But due to science and the mixing of powders and potions, he also becomes Mr. Hyde. And he physically changes when he's Mr. Hyde. He's shorter and I think he's bald. And he's nasty. And through Mr. Hyde, he's able to indulge all of his wicked, more animalistic sensations, because if he commits any crime or does anything that's looked down upon, well, he'll return to being Dr. Jekyll, and no one can possibly imagine that Mr. Hyde is Dr. Jekyll. The story starts basically again with this story where you've got a man who was talking to a friend on a walk, and they pass this particular house. Notice the house again in Gothic. And this house stands out prominently from the street, which the street's quite nice, but this house end is sort of blank with just a door in it. And the friend of the narrator says, "Do you see that house? Well, it's associated with a particular man and a sensational story." And then it goes backwards to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And again, what we're doing is we're trying to establish this sense of reality that is with what seems fantastic, but there's an element within us that we recognise, the inner, what's the word, the inner caveman, you know, the right primitive being, the animal. And we learn all about how right at the beginning, this man was walking along the street when suddenly he saw a small, nasty looking character whom he instantly took a dislike to, who happens to be Mr. Hyde, just trample on this young girl. Now it's 3 a.m, so we're in the dark. And this girl has been sent to get a doctor for someone who must be poorly in one of the nearby buildings. And she screams, and suddenly loads of people come out and they're shaking Mr. Hyde around. And eventually he has to go and get some money to pay off the family. And it leads to this house. And so the story begins. But what's explored in this story is very interesting. It is the psychology, the split personality of the human being. And if there are 2 parts of us, maybe even 3, 4 different parts of us. But what is particularly noticeable in our self-education on the Gothic is where all this takes place. It's in London. It's a bit like Sherlock Holmes, you see. London becomes the oppressive atmosphere. It becomes the wilderness. Normally, up to this point, everything's set isolated in nature, and you have the sublime overawed by being in nature and wild nature. If I can say nature anymore, I'll try to. But with Jekyll and Hyde, he wasn't the first, but it just stood out. London is the wilderness, full of its myriad labyrinthine streets and alleyways, its crooked and bent houses, its contrasting of rich areas to poor areas, to poverty and gentlemanliness. And that's combined with a bit of the weather, fog, and an interesting play with lights, when lights appear at the changes of scene between Jekyll and Hyde, or when something bad's about to happen. So you'll see quite a lot of that. And the idea of that is sort of the metonymic influence of Gothic in a story. But at the same time, it's not pure Gothic. It's beginning to push into the exploration of more serious ideas rather than just a sensational piece of literature. So that is then a good book to read in your self-education on the development of Gothic literature through the ages. Our 5th work that I recommend you look at if you want to develop your understanding of the Gothic genre and how its blood red thread starts running into and out of various different topics and ideas for the day and into different genres itself, is a story that you've probably come across, but I don't know whether you'll have read it. It's a short novel by a woman called Charlotte Gilman, and it's called The Yellow Wallpaper. Have you heard of it? Have you read it? Now, The Yellow Wallpaper, there's a lot that can be said about this, and I'm trying to keep it strictly on the Gothic. The yellow wallpaper is very interesting and very claustrophobic. It focuses and uses that idea of complete isolation and complete oppression and threat and being overwhelmed. And the way it's done is it's written in a first-person narrative, in a journal style, by a woman who's given birth and then fallen into a nervous hysteria or a depression, what we would call postnatal depression. And her husband is a physician. And for her own good, he sets her up for bed rest for her physical and mental health. But this bed rest is awful because she's placed and locked basically in one room, which has got yellow wallpaper. Now in this room there's bars on the windows and there's a gate going up the stairs, and the bed's nailed to the floor, would you believe? So it's pretty grim. I think you even have manacles somewhere, if I remember rightly. So you got this dungeon idea, which is typically Gothic, but this is taking place in a respectable home. And so we've got this twist. And what's added to the bewilderment as you read it, it's a clever sort of twist that Gilman uses, is we have an unreliable narrator who doesn't give us all the information. So we get twists and turns, and we have a building weight that lands upon us, a building sense that things are not right until they're absolutely appalling. Quite a lot of people think this book's really chilling. Now, it's called the yellow wallpaper because in that room there is yellow wallpaper, which is sort of ripped and torn. I think she calls it an interminable, it looks like an interminable sort of line of toadstools all budding and sprouting into endless convolutions. And the longer she's in there, the worse this wallpaper gets, the worse the room gets. And so we've got psychological trauma. This is taking the Gothic from literal threat, and there is some in the yellow wallpaper, but to the inner. And this is probably more resonant with us because most of our fears don't come true. It's what we imagine. Psychologically, we can torment ourselves. And the yellow wallpaper plays upon that. And as I say, it's quite a short story, so you can get through it quick sticks, but a brilliant piece of work. And it will show you how enduring the style of Gothic is. Remember, this is 100 years after Anne Radcliffe, and the primary framework is still the same as Frankenstein, for instance. But what's so interesting is, again, how Gothic has been manoeuvred into a different avenue. This seems to specifically take shot at the male physician, really. It's sort of it makes dangerous the male-dominated medical industry and its disregard for women, constantly calling them hysterical and not taking them seriously. So a man might have psychological problems and get help, a woman's just locked up in some mental institution, because in that respect, the room is very much symbolic of a mental home where people are just shut up and chained in. So that's another great piece of work that you'll want to read in your self-education of the Gothic genre and its development through time. It also takes us to the tipping point into the 20th century for our next two books. Our sixth book is from 1939 and epitomizes the outgrowth of Gothic into genres of its own, and that book is And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. Agatha Christie, of course, the great populariser of the murder mystery novel. Not the first to write them, but definitely the populariser, especially with the Penguin paperbacks, which people took on the train and made everything easy to read while they were going to work. Now, Then There Were None, Agatha Christie herself says it was the most challenging of her books, but I would say it's her best. I know plenty of you will disagree with me on that. Everyone has their favourite Agatha Christie, but this one This takes all of the Gothic ideas and brings them back from 140 years before, but this time wraps them around a murder mystery. The plot goes like this. There are 10 people who receive anonymous invitations to go and be at this really nice house that's situated on an island just off the south coast of England. I think it's off the south coast. In my mind, it's off Cornwall. Anyway, these 10 people get to this place at the appointed time, and they're from all disparate kinds of backgrounds, but they don't know each other. And it's a bit awkward when they come in. So already we've got isolation on an island. We've got unease because no one knows each other, and the weather is not great. So the typical rainstorm. In fact, the rain makes sea surges which cuts them off completely. In one of the rooms after they've had dinner, they still haven't met their host. No one seems to know where the host is or who the host is. There's a butler there, there's a maid there. I think that's the only 2 people. Now they go in to have drinks in the lounge, and on the table, I think it's maybe a table to the side actually, there's a little board with 10 little soldiers. And this is based off a nursery rhyme. And again, this is a little play on the Gothic, isn't it? Taking something innocent and making it sinister. You see it a lot in films, you know, if there's a murder in the house, it will often cut to a room like a nursery where there's a doll, you know, which is supposed to be innocent, and you'll have the little tinkling box, chiming box playing a children's nursery rhyme, but you know that some maniac is coming up the stairs. Now, this is basically what's going on here. You've got these 10 little soldiers. And then, this is all very early on, the lights go out. Okay, great, typical trope. And when they come back on, someone's dead. They've dropped dead, they've been poisoned or something. I can't remember now. I remember being terrified reading this because I read it on a really windy, gale-swept night. And, yeah, it really freaked me out. But this person's dead and everyone's like, oh no, what's happened? And then someone says, hey, weren't there 10 little soldiers on that tray? And everyone's like, yes. But now there's only 9. So when one person dies, one of the soldiers goes missing. And so begins a progression through the nursery rhyme, which would lead to the final line, and then there were none. And because everyone knows that this is the nursery rhyme, they're all beginning to worry that they're all going to be killed and a soldier removed each time from the board. But who's doing it? And who invited them? And can they get away? That's the plot. What's so great about this is by the time you've read the previous 5 books, you will recognise all of the framework of the Gothic literature. The twist in the tale and executing the plot would have been really hard to write. But the atmosphere built around it, you can see has come from the past. You can see how it's laid out right before you. You begin to read it with so much more understanding and appreciation. You would pick that book up by this point and go, I can see why this is Gothic. It's just brilliant, but why it's important is because of its development, the Gothic development here into the genre, the branch of literature that we call detective mysteries or murder mysteries, the whodunit. And so the enduring effect of the Gothic appeal. And of course, crime literature, after love, crime literature, murder mysteries are the top genre for people to read. So there's the 6th book you'll want to read in your self-training of what constitutes Gothic literature and how it develops through time. Now we come to our final and 7th book in our self-education course. And I think this one is going to surprise you because it's not a book you would think of as Gothic. And here's something to be said now. Categorically saying this is Gothic, this is romance, this is modern, this is postmodern, this is realistic, this is aesthetic, this whatever. you can't do it. Genres bleed into one another. And the Gothic genre is the most mercurial, along with love actually, because you can put love in pretty much any situation. But you can put the Gothic, the sense of fear, terror, panic. You can put that into most situations. And that's why the Gothic tends to bleed into other pieces of literature. But the next book shows how Gothic has made another branch of literature and influenced it and created a framework on which to build it, which always holds our attention. And that's the dystopian novel. And so our seventh book for seeing how the Gothic genre has developed through time and branched out was written in 1949. Do you know what it is? It's the book 1984 by George Orwell. Now, this book is a fantastic piece of work. It's prophetic, it's political, it's modern, it's ideological, it's social examination, and it's Gothic. The Gothic is the most subtle in this book out of all the ones mentioned, but it's there. You have Winston Smith, who works at the Ministry of Truth in Airstrip 1, which happens to be Britain in the future. And his job is to go through old newspaper accounts and change the information so that the government, known as Big Brother, is able to tell people what to think. It's the use of the mainstream media to manipulate people's idea of the government, to keep them completely subject. And if they think, hang on, didn't the government say this and now they've changed their mind? Well, Winston's job is to gaslight, basically. They're rewriting the news. So if anyone looked back on the news, it would say something different to what they originally were told, and they'll think, oh, I must have got it wrong. And it keeps them dumb. People also have no privacy. The book starts with Winston going into Victory Mansions, and he actually sees the big billboard of Big Brother is watching you, all in colour, as if that's a good thing, taking care of them. And he goes into his room, and what's amazing is there's this like grey screen, and this grey screen can send a message, talk, propaganda, but it can listen as well, and it can see. I mean, how prophetic is that? Through the wireless age, we now can have people listen in on our phones, would you believe? There's no privacy because we do our shopping and all of that's recorded. I find it remarkable that Orwell could perceive a state like that. But Orwell finds that there's a little spot in his room that he can sit and write a diary, which if it were found, he'd be punished for, but he keeps his thoughts on it. And it just builds from there. The sense of claustrophobia, the sense of a lack of basic privacy, a basic human right, that you are just a cog in the machine. You get the word prole from this, from the proletariat, the commoner. People are just insignificant. They're there to uphold someone at the top. And this person, Big Brother, by the way, very much the cult of personality. Like Joseph Stalin, like the leaders of the Soviet Union were held up, Lenin as well. And eventually Winston meets someone, and it's his story of how he begins to rebel. But the danger involved in that, you've not just got the Ministry of Truth, you've got the Ministry of Love as well, and various other ministries. There's 4 of them, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But it's how he begins to rebel, but the ever-present threat, the grand edifice of the ministry and of Big Brother is this daunting sort of grey block of a world. It's a bit like Jekyll and Hyde, not the split personality, although you do get things like double think in this book, and the ability to think 2 opposing things at the same time. But the wilderness, the area you're isolated in, is actually the city. Because, yeah, it's hard to describe. It's just fantastic as a book. But what's so beneficial regarding this video is that reading 1984 after the other 6 books have developed the idea of the Gothic, it tells you something about what makes us who we are. It explains our inner feelings, our inner responses to the society and world we live in. And one of the greatest things you'll get out of this is that as much as modern education seems to scorn the past, as if it was primitive, as if we know more now, reading this and then reading to 1984, you'll see that human beings, though fashions have changed, they have not. All of the basic feelings, emotions, thoughts, worries, pleasures, delights, anxieties have remained the same. The fundamental questions remain the same. The political sphere pretty much remains the same. Economically, the way we're societally structured, things don't really change. And the way we interact with that world, we immediately recognise in the Gothic genre. So there are the 7 books which I recommend if you want to teach yourself, to educate yourself in the classics by your own autodidactism, self-teaching, to use the posh word for it. Go through those books and just enjoy them and let them wash over you and develop a cognizance, an awareness of how the Gothic literature framework works. If you're a writer, it will help you very much if you want to write murder mysteries, dystopian novels, suspense, thrillers. All of this will help. And it will just enhance the appreciation of what you're reading. It becomes like being a connoisseur of wine. You'll begin to distinguish the various tastes and aromas that come out of these different books, all from one genre, but planted in different soils, as it were. So those books again were Anne Radcliffe's The Italian, the start, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Charlotte Gilman's Yellow Wallpaper, Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, and finally George Orwell's 1984. I really, really hope you get to read these, and I really hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, and you really, really want to help me, and you're grateful, smash the like button, subscribe, but please, 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 this helps me more than anything else. Comment, even if it's just, thanks, I enjoyed this. Say it, it helps the algorithm no end. And if you really want to be special to me, if you're in a book group anywhere, online or in Facebook book group, share this to it so that other people can come and enjoy it for themselves. Anyway, until the next video, I wish you joy in your Gothic adventure.